The summer of 1861 in Virginia was a season of smoke and silence. The air trembled with the heat of war and whispered secrets that the magnolia trees seemed to keep. The old plantations of the Shenandoah Valley still stood proud, but the soil beneath them had begun to curdle with unease. Among them rose the Caldwell estate, 3 stories of whitewashed brick, shaded by ancient oaks, and ruled by a woman whose grief had turned her into something unrecognizable. Her name was Eliza Caldwell, widow of Captain Nathaniel Caldwell, a man whose name still lingered in hushed conversation long after his death. He had been cruel, charming, and powerful, a master in every sense of the word. His slaves feared him, his peers envied him. When the fever took him, it was said even the devil waited to see if his soul would descend or rise, but Eliza did not cry at his burial. She only stood in her black lace, watching the coffin lower into the earth, as though it were not her husband but a beast finely caged. In the weeks after the funeral, whispers began. The lady of Caldwell Hall had not left her home, not even for Sunday Mass. Curtains remained drawn, the piano collected dust. The slaves who worked the grounds said they saw her walking through the gardens at night, barefoot, carrying a single candle, speaking to no one. Some said she wandered to the field quarters and stood outside the cabins, listening. To what, they didn't know. Among the enslaved was a man named Josiah. He had been Nathaniel's favorite, strong, silent, and obedient, or so he appeared. Nathaniel had trusted him with every task, from handling horses to keeping accounts. But what Nathaniel never knew was that Josiah was educated, taught in secret by the plantation's former tutor before the man was dismissed. Josiah could read, write, and think faster than most men born free. He had once told his mother that he would find a way to free not just himself, but every soul chained to Caldwell soil. When Eliza sent for him one night, Josiah expected punishment. But instead, he found her sitting before the parlor fire, her hair unpinned, her black gown slipping from her shoulders. She looked nothing like the mistress he had known. There was something wild in her eyes, something that belonged to neither the living nor the dead. "Do you hate him?" she asked softly. Josiah froze. "Ma'am, my husband, the captain, do you hate him?" He did not answer. To speak against the master, even a dead one, was dangerous, but she saw the truth in his silence. Her lips curved faintly. "Good," she said, "then we understand each other." From that night on, she called him often, at first only to fetch firewood or pour her brandy, then to sit with her in the silence. She began to ask questions about the fields, about the men her husband had beaten, about the things she had never cared to know when Nathaniel lived. Josiah spoke carefully, but there was something in her voice that drew him closer each time. It wasn't kindness, it was vengeance, raw and sharp, burning in the hollow left by grief. By autumn, the Caldwell estate had become an island. The war had drained its neighbors of sons and laborers, and soldiers had begun to march through the valley. But within those walls, Eliza and Josiah formed something neither of them understood. She spoke of revenge as if it were scripture. He listened, and for the first time the balance between them shifted. One night she brought him to her husband's study. The air still smelled of pipe smoke and old leather. On the desk lay Nathaniel's journal, open to a page filled with cruel numbers. Sales, punishments, prices of flesh. She asked Josiah to read them aloud. He did, his voice steady, though his hands trembled. He owned everything, she said quietly, even me. Then she looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her broke. The widow who had once been porcelain and restraint reached for him as if she were drowning. That night, the line between master and slave dissolved beneath the weight of grief and fury. It wasn't love, not yet. It was survival, a joining of wounds. In the weeks that followed, the servants began to notice the change. Josiah now entered the main house freely. He ate from the same table. He spoke to her without bowing his head. And Eliza, once a ghost of lace and mourning, now walked with a strange fire in her eyes. The overseer quit without explanation. The neighboring families whispered that sin had overtaken the widow Caldwell. One even claimed to have seen her at Josiah's cabin at midnight, her hair unbound, her feet bare in the mud. By the first frost she called him husband. The marriage was never written, never blessed, never spoken aloud beyond the walls of the estate. But to her it was sacred. To him it was a beginning. Together they tore down the slave quarters, freed the remaining hands, and turned the Caldwell lands into a refuge for those who had nowhere else to go. But vengeance, once called, never sleeps long. Rumors reached the town that Eliza Caldwell had taken her husband's slave to bed, had burned his will, had spat on his grave. Soon men with torches gathered at her gate. When they came, Josiah stood beside her on the veranda, unarmed but unafraid. She wore her widow's gown again, but without the veil. The men shouted scripture, cursed her name, called her witch, harlot, blasphemer. She did not flinch. "You loved him?" Josiah asked quietly. She smiled faintly. "I love the fire that took him from me more." Then the first torch hit the porch rail, and the Caldwell estate went up like dry paper. When dawn came, the house was gone. Only ashes and twisted iron remained. But the people of the valley swore that on quiet nights, when the moon was high, they could still see two figures walking among the ruins, a white woman and a dark man, hand in hand, staring down at the land that had once owned them both. Some said it was vengeance, others said it was love, but those who knew the story of Eliza Caldwell whispered that it was both, and that some oaths once taken in fire can never truly die. The ruins of Caldwell Hall smoldered for days. By the time the fire had eaten through every beam and banister, nothing was left but a blackened chimney and the scent of charred magnolia. The townspeople came in silence, pretending they were there to help bury what remained, but really they came to stare, to make certain that sin had been punished, that the whispers of a widow's madness had finally burned away. Yet among the ashes they found no bodies, only a single ring, melted and warped, glinting like an eye beneath the soot. For weeks after, riders searched the woods. They found boot prints and bare footprints leading toward the river, then vanishing into the reeds. Some said Josiah and Eliza drowned themselves, choosing water over the rope that surely awaited them. Others claimed they fled north, disguised as fugitives, but the truth was stranger still. Eliza and Josiah had survived. Through smoke and choking heat, they had escaped down the servants' passage hidden behind the cellar wall, a place Eliza herself had discovered in her husband's ledgers years before. The air inside was foul, but it carried them beyond the reach of fire and men alike. For 2 days they crawled through the marsh, drinking from muddy pools, until the flames were only a distant glow behind them. They found shelter in an abandoned farmhouse near the river's bend. The place had been empty since its owner went to war, its windows boarded, its fields untended. There Eliza cleaned the burns on Josiah's arms and stitched a gash across his shoulder with trembling fingers. He told her they had to keep moving, but she looked at the land beyond the porch, at the smoke curling over the valley, and said quietly, "Not yet." Each night the thunder of cannon fire echoed far away. The war was spreading, swallowing towns and loyalties alike. Men in blue and men in gray came and went through the valley, taking food, taking lives. To most the Caldwells were ghosts now, their names cursed or forgotten. That suited them fine. As winter crept close, Eliza began to change. The widow's pallor softened. The feverish glint in her eyes gave way to a cold determination. She spoke often of those who had come with torches, of the men who had spit her husband's name as if it were a blessing while cursing hers. Josiah warned her to let go. That vengeance only chained the soul. But she shook her head. "You were chained for his sins," she whispered. "Let me bear them now." She began to send letters, unsigned, untraceable. Messages to neighboring estates, to the wives who had smiled while her husband struck others down, to the overseers who had built their fortunes on blood. Within weeks, small fires began to bloom across the valley. Barns, granaries, storehouses, always at night, always in silence. The people called it divine wrath. Only 1 or 2 suspected the truth. Josiah had not wanted to be part of her vengeance, but he could not leave her. There was something terrible and magnetic in her resolve. She moved through the world like a spirit wronged, her pale face framed by black veils, her voice quiet but sharp enough to cut. Together they built a refuge beneath the farmhouse cellar, a network of tunnels leading to the river. There they began sheltering runaways, men, women, and children fleeing through the night, following whispered rumors of a widow who freed slaves and burned masters. They came to call her the White Widow. The irony was not lost on Josiah. Her name became both legend and curse. Preachers called her damned, freedmen called her savior, and though she never sought glory, she began to wear the title like armor. When Josiah begged her to rest, she would only answer, "I am resting him," and glance toward the hills where her husband's ashes had mixed with soil. By the second spring, the farmhouse had become a beacon. Safe houses spread from it like veins. Soldiers, deserters, and those cast adrift by war found food and shelter under her roof. Yet peace was fleeting. One night, a stranger arrived, Union blue faded to gray with dust, his badge tarnished but his eyes sharp. He asked for water. Josiah gave him a cup. The man's gaze lingered on Eliza too long. "You ain't what they say you are," he said quietly. "You're worse." Josiah reached for his pistol, but Eliza stopped him. "And what do they say I am?" she asked. The soldier smiled. "A widow who makes slaves her lovers and burns her own kin. A ghost in black who walks the old roads with a knife." Eliza only nodded. "Then they've seen me true." That night, the soldier vanished before dawn. By noon, riders were in the valley again. The White Widow's sanctuary had been betrayed. They came with dogs and rifles. Josiah gathered those he could and led them through the tunnels, urging Eliza to flee. But she lingered in the parlor, her hand brushing the cracked glass of a mirror, her reflection a ghostly blur. "If I run forever," she whispered, "they will never remember who I was, only what they made me." Josiah seized her hand. "Then let them remember us together." They escaped through the marsh again, but this time the pursuit was relentless. Shots cracked through the trees. One grazed Eliza's shoulder. Another split Josiah's arm. Still, they pressed on, following the river until their strength broke. Finally, they found refuge in an old chapel swallowed by vines. There, beneath the broken stained glass, they waited in silence. When dawn came, Eliza lay with her head against Josiah's chest, listening to the faint rhythm of his heart. She spoke softly, almost to herself. "If they catch us, they'll hang me first, but they'll fear you more." He touched her cheek. "Then they'll never take me alive." The sun rose red over the valley that morning. Riders found the chapel by its smoke, but inside they discovered only ashes and footprints leading to the river. Some said the pair drowned again, their bodies never found. Others claimed they walked into the fog and were swallowed whole by it, but years later, travelers swore they saw two figures along the water at dusk, a woman in black and a man beside her, hands clasped, eyes bright with fire. And wherever they walked, the plantations burned anew. By the summer of 1863, the war had devoured everything. The land was ash and silence, the rivers choked with the bodies of soldiers and the dreams of those who had once believed in freedom. The Caldwell name had long since faded into rumor. Only the legend of the White Widow remained, spoken in whispers by those who lit their way north by her unseen hand. Far from the valley where the old plantation once stood, Eliza and Josiah now lived beneath the guise of travelers, silent, weary, and unrecognizable. They moved from town to town, never lingering long enough to draw attention. But the world was closing in. Bounties had been posted, one for the slave who escaped his master's fire, and another for the woman who burned her own estate to the ground. Together, they had become the most hunted pair in Virginia. In a small settlement near the Rappahannock, they found a kind of uneasy peace. The house was little more than a shack, its roof patched with tin, its walls leaning like tired bones, but it was safe, and for a brief span they allowed themselves to believe in stillness. Eliza began tending to the wounded soldiers who stumbled in from the front lines, bandaging their arms and whispering prayers over them. Josiah built coffins for the dead, carving crosses for graves that would never bear their names. At night they spoke in low tones by candlelight. Josiah dreamed of building a school once the war was done, a place where the children of the enslaved could learn what had been forbidden. Eliza listened, her eyes reflecting the flame, but she never spoke of the future. Her world had always been the past, the man she'd buried, the sins she'd burned, the faces that still haunted her sleep. Then, one night, a knock came at the door. It was a soldier again, but this one wore no uniform. His beard was gray, his coat torn, and his voice low with exhaustion. He asked for water. Josiah hesitated, but Eliza, ever the caretaker, offered him a seat by the fire. As he drank, his gaze drifted across the room and landed on the ring she wore, a ring that had melted in fire long ago. "I knew that ring," he murmured. "Captain Caldwell wore it when I served with him. You his widow." Eliza's hand froze. The room seemed to still around her. The man smiled faintly, cruelly. "They said you died in the fire. Guess the devil doesn't take every sinner." Before Josiah could move, the soldier pulled a pistol. "There's a bounty for both of you," he said. "Dead or alive makes no difference." The shot cracked through the night, scattering the candlelight like shattered glass. The bullet missed, striking the wall. Josiah lunged, tackling the man, and the two wrestled across the floor. Eliza screamed, grabbing a fallen poker from the hearth. In the struggle, another shot rang out, then silence. When the smoke cleared, the soldier lay still, blood seeping into the dirt floor. Josiah was on his knees, clutching his side. Eliza dropped beside him, pressing her hands to the wound, but it was deep. "Too deep, don't speak," she whispered. He smiled faintly, his breath shallow. "You said, vengeance never sleeps." Tears streaked her soot, stained cheeks. "It doesn't, but I can make it rest." He tried to laugh, but the sound broke. "Then, promise me you'll live, not as his widow, not as my ghost, just live." She pressed her forehead to his, feeling his warmth fade. "I've only ever been what the fire made me." When morning came, she buried him beneath the willow by the river. She used her hands, digging until her fingers bled. Over his grave, she carved two words into the soft wood of a fallen plank: "My freedom." That night, she walked alone to the old road, where the fog hung low over the fields. She wore her black gown again, torn and tattered from years of flight. In one hand, she held Josiah's ring, in the other, her husband's knife. She stared at the horizon until dawn broke over the hills. By the next week, the house was gone, burned to its foundations, just as Caldwell Hall had been. No one ever saw the widow again. Some said she joined the Union lines, tending to the wounded until the war's end. Others claimed she drowned herself in the same river that had carried their footprints once before. But the freedmen who followed her cause told another story. They said that on nights when the air was heavy and the wind smelled of magnolia and smoke, a woman in black walked the backroads of Virginia. They said she carried a candle that never went out, leading those still bound in chains toward the water and freedom beyond it. And beside her walked a man with eyes like ember light, his shadow tall as the trees. Together they were vengeance made flesh, love born of ruin, walking hand in hand through the heart of a burning world. And wherever they passed, the chains that once bound the South began to fall, one by one, into the dust.